Hi, this is the Bibletouchstone. I'm responding to a video from Swenner64, and he actually made a video response to a new buddy of mine, Only the Scriptures. Was Matthew chapter 24 fulfilled in AD 70? Now, Swenner64 proposes a partial preterist interpretation of Luke chapter 21, and his main thesis is that Luke chapter 21 deals, it's a different sermon. The events recorded therein record a different sermon than those recorded in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark chapter 13. I've actually heard an argument like this before in an article by Jonathan H. Barlow, and Swenner is positing that Luke chapter 21 was given in the temple, and I'll address what I believe is his scriptural appeal and internal evidence for this a little later on in the video, and that afterwards, after he gave that sermon in the temple, then he went and retired in the Mount of Olives, where he gave a private discourse of a different central theme in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark chapter 13. Now, there are problems with this case that I'm going to appeal to, not exactly the general absurdity of his claim that is in contradiction with the general agreement from Bible expositors and commentators on the Olivet Discourse, because that would be an appeal to tradition. But I'm going to focus on the particular claims and appeals from Swenner64 here. And he says that Luke chapter 24 records the physical events of the first century that were fulfilled in that generation, that is, to him, the destruction of the temple and the seizure and capture of Jerusalem and God's judgment against them physically. And then Matthew chapter 24 would then address eschatological elements, including the return of the Son of Man and the gathering of the elect. Now, he's saying that there's two focuses and two central themes, that it must be two different sermons. So my question to him is, if Jesus gives a sermon in Luke chapter 21, then why would the disciples then inquire on the subject that he had already addressed in that sermon? Why would they ask him afresh in Matthew chapter 24 if that sequentially anteceded the sermon from Luke chapter 21? And that is, in Matthew chapter 24, in first verse, it says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple." So first, why would they show him these things? Perhaps this could be a recapitulation of this sermon imagined by Swenner64, but that's verging on hermeneutical liberalism, and I'm not sure how he can make his appeals anymore if he's just going to decide what the text is, or suggest that even though there's two different central themes by two different sermons, that Matthew takes the liberty in compiling them into one sermon, or hashing around and making two different central themes another central theme. That would question the reliability and the trustworthiness of Matthew as a testimony of the gospel. Then it says, the response of the disciples in verse 2 is, in verse 2 Jesus says that there won't be one stone left there that will stand upon another, that won't be thrown down. Why would Jesus continue on if he already gave an apparent description of when that would take place, that is fulfilled in that generation? And then the disciples then inquired, "When shall these things be?" And of course, in Matthew, they relate that with the sign of his coming and the end of the world, or the end of the age. So my question is, why would Jesus describe when that would happen in the first generation in Luke chapter 21, but then all of a sudden the disciples were still clueless? Well, Swenner suggests that the eschatological elements given arbitrarily and haphazardly in Luke chapter 21 kind of kindled in the minds of the disciples, so then they asked them, well, when's the end of the age? When's the second coming? But first, in Matthew, the first and primary question that's resounded in Mark chapter 13 is, when shall these things be? Specifically, the destruction of the temple. Also, there's a literary sequence you see in Luke chapter 22, Matthew chapter 26, and Mark chapter 14. The next literary event is the Passover soon, the betrayal and the crucifixion of the Son of Man is anticipated. And also Matthew chapter 23 shows preaching of Jesus in the temple. And though Jesus does say that their house is left to them desolate, and he describes in that generation Jerusalem would be judged, it is not as good of a parallel as Matthew chapter 24, which gives a lot of the same parallel content with Luke chapter 21. So Swenner is sort of implying a very liberal hermeneutic for his rule of faith. Swenner also calls all three of the synoptics, the record, the Olivet Discourse, which also weakens his appeal. He also appeals to the parable of the fig tree, and I can't remember if he was suggesting that that was a sign in Luke chapter 21 or Matthew chapter 24, but in Luke chapter 21, it says, starting at verse 27, "And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And he said unto them a parable, Behold, a fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know with your own selves that summer is now at hand. So likewise ye, when you see these things come to pass, know that ye that the kingdom of God is at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall not pass away, and my word shall not pass away." So another question is, why is the same allegory, if these are different sermons, why is the same allegory employed to describe two different kinds of fulfillment? And here in Luke, we also see contextually those things that were going to be fulfilled, that were a sign that the kingdom had been inaugurated, was the seeing of the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory, and the redemption drawing nigh. And if that was to happen in that first generation, then you really haven't solved anything, because Matthew chapter 24, which you suggest is coming of the Son of Man, if you appeal to the conservative interpretation of this generation in Luke chapter 21, then it would be irresponsible for you to discredit that in Matthew chapter 24 when it says those same things would be fulfilled in that generation. On the last appeal, I think he's saying that Luke chapter 21 must have been in the temple, that sermon, so it must have been another sermon. Well, in verse 37-38, I think this is what he's appealing to. It says, "In the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives." Matthew Henry also talks about this, how Jesus spoke in the temple during those days in Jerusalem, and then afterwards at night he went and retired in the Olivet Discourse, in the Mount of Olives, where he may have given a private discourse to the disciples. Now, from this text, it cannot be logically inferred by necessity that the sermon given in Luke chapter 21 was in the temple. Well, it does show that if it were in the daytime, then he must have preached in the temple, but if it happened at night, then it must have been on the Mount of Olives in a private discourse to the disciples, where Matthew chapter 24, using our rule of faith, suggests that it had to have happened on the Mount of Olives. And Young's literal translation and Revised Standard Version kind of elucidate the classical Greek, where it says, "In the days he went and spoke in the temple," and Revised Standard says, "In every day he was teaching in the temple every night on the Mount of Olives." So it's not this text that he's alluding to, it doesn't necessarily imply that Jesus was in the temple when he gave the sermon in Luke chapter 21, as always, grace be to you.